To talk a little bit about world history. It's one of the advocacy campaigns that we've been working on for the past 4.5, almost 5 years. It really has been a focus of the Ohio Council for the Social Studies since House Bill 1 was passed back in the summer of 2009 by Ted Strickland. And at that point, we noticed a couple of things. One, our tests for grades 5 and 8 were gone. And that's what our keynote this morning was talking about. Campaign victory for us this summer that those have been added back. They're just going to be at grades 4 and 6. But we know we're not 100% test happy at the Ohio Council for Social Studies, but we do know what gets tested gets taught. And I know from experiences even in my own district and from stories I've heard from other folks, when it comes down to test time for the OAAs, and your reading and math scores may not be exactly what they need to be, then it's time to put social studies and science aside and focus on those tests. So having those tests back is a really important thing for us, particularly in the intermediate grades. And then when kids hit 7th grade, then we know that in most cases they're going to have a social studies class every day for 45 minutes. The other advocacy campaign we've been working on is the World History Bill. And again, this goes back to 2009, and the board has been actively engaged at that point, lobbying at the Ohio State House and lobbying the State Board of Education. And most recently, and our keynote today is Senator Frank Larose from the 27th District, and the Senate District, which is near Summit, Stark County, and all of Wayne County. But we were speaking to him, and actually I want to give credit to Dr. Brad Magooth to reach out to Senator Rose, who kind of got the ball rolling there in his campaign also, that he went out, he was on a short TV spot and talking about this issue, that when the OGT goes away, that world history as a requirement goes away. And our governor and the governor before has spoke about we're preparing kids for the global economy and the challenges of the 21st century. And it's just ironic that world history is on the chopping block. So to introduce our keynote speaker for this lunch session, Senator Frank Larose, and he is a decorated veteran. He's with 10 years of service. He served in the U.S. Army in the 101st Airborne, and also for a time in Special Forces as a Green Beret. He also has numerous commendations and a Bronze Star. He is a graduate of The Ohio State University in Consumer Affairs and Business, and he lives in Copley Township, and he also graduated from Copley High School with his wife Lauren and his 2 daughters. So I want to ask Senator Rose to come up and talk about Senate Bill 96 and why it's important for the Ohio Council for Social Studies and really all Ohioans to support world history in Ohio.
Thank you. Appreciate the chance to join you today for this, and I think that everybody in this room has probably taught the lesson how a bill becomes a law, or we've all learned the lesson of how a bill becomes a law, but this is the how a bill really becomes a law, or the Paul Harvey version, the rest of the story. So I was there at home one night minding my own business, checking Facebook, and had a message from Dr. Magooth, right back there, and it was something along the lines of, why don't you do something to save world history, or can you help us save world history, or something like that. And I think my response, maybe it was being kind of a wise guy, but I didn't know world history was under attack. I didn't know that there was an issue with it. And so anyway, we started corresponding, and as a result worked on developing a piece of legislation and have now gotten it passed through the Senate Education Committee. But more on that in a few minutes. When this first was brought to my attention, it was a natural fit for me and something I really wanted to work on. My experience in the military, particularly serving in a special operations unit, taught me how important it was for all Ohioans, all Americans really, to have a solid grasp of world history and cultures, and to have a good understanding of what goes on everywhere else but here. When I was going overseas, I would generally endeavor to study the culture that I was going to be interacting with. That was a real asset to me, particularly in the Special Operations Unit, where we were called upon to be ambassadors. We were called upon to be diplomats as much as soldiers, because we were often working with our allies in parts of the world where they didn't know many Americans. And so we were there to represent this country, and we had to be knowledgeable about the people that we were working with and their culture and their history in order to do so. And the studies that I undertook on my own before, for example, before I went to Iraq, I spent a lot of time reading up on the history of Mesopotamia and the sort of cultural and political evolutions that caused Iraq to be what it is today. And I also spent some time in Northern Africa, and I did the same kind of studies when I was going there. Spent some time in Kosovo and Bulgaria and Macedonia, and so before I went to the Balkans, I did that kind of study as well. Now, I was lucky that growing up, I was interested in social studies. It was my favorite class, and I had some great teachers at Copley School District. Anybody here from Copley? All right. And had some great teachers at Copley that helped nurture my love of social studies, and it's something that made me who I am today. The reason that this was a natural for me also was that we all talk about trying to grow the economy in Ohio, and that I think is one of our number one goals in state government. Certainly is one of mine, and I think that we all realize that each one of us are able to and frequently do transact global commerce on a daily basis. It's something that is almost a paradigm shift. I think 3 or 4 generations ago, it was only nations that could. 4 or 5 generations ago, it was only nations that could transact global commerce, and then it became nations and large multinational businesses. And today's generation, anybody that has one of these darn things on their belt or in their purse can conduct global commerce at a moment's notice while you're sitting here not paying attention to me, for example. And so the ability to understand the world in which we live and be smart as far as how we compete on a global level is necessary. So if you care about economic development, you care about world history. As my last example stated, if you care about national defense, you care about world history. And the men and women that we're training today, the men and women that you train in your classrooms, that will be our next generation of leaders, need to have that solid understanding of world history, culture, and geography in order to be diplomats and soldiers and business leaders and the next generation of teachers and the next generation of politicians, if they can't find something else better to do for a living. So what we started with Senate Bill 96 was a conversation, and when I first started circulating it around the Senate, the reaction that a lot of my colleagues had was the same reaction that I had to Dr. McGuth initially, was I didn't realize there was a problem. What we were able to explain, and many of you hopefully that spoke with your state senators were able to explain, was that with the changing in testing, that there was no longer going to be a component of the testing that covered world history. And as we all understand, unfortunately, in most cases, if it's the most important thing in a lot of people's minds is the test, and so the test kind of dictates curriculum. So the approach that we took, I think, was a pretty reasonable one when we drafted Senate Bill 96, and it was simply that there are 3 social studies requirements. You're all familiar with this, and currently, as a result of legislation 2 years ago, there is one of those which is entirely composed of U.S.-based studies, and that's a result of the founding documents bill. That's great. And then there's the other 2 that are sort of left. Well, what we said is if there's going to be 3 social studies requirements and one of them has to be American-based, let's make one of them world-based, the other 96% of the globe. and then the third one be left open as far as all of the wonderful options that exist out there for other choices for what we're going to teach in social studies. Again, we didn't want to dictate curriculum down to each local school district, and what we wanted to do is just sort of set a standard that if one of those three units is going to be US based, then the second one should be world based. Now, when I started hearing from some folks that were, I think, uninformed about what I was trying to do, they had some concerns. They raised some concerns that I was trying to put too much focus on world studies and not enough on American studies. And what I explained to them was that no, actually, this is the opposite of that. This provides a support, a buttress, if you will, to the work that that my colleagues did in the world history, or in the U.S. Founding Documents Bill, because that U.S. Founding Documents Bill is sort of a one-legged stool unless you have world history as part of that curriculum requirement as well. And to really understand how magnificent, quite honestly, the accomplishment of this country has been, and the founding of this country, and what we've accomplished in just over 200 years, you have to understand the rest of world history as well. So what I would ask each of you to do is to help me. As I've said to people, this is also part of that how a bill really becomes a law. It's not just good enough to have a good idea and a well-written bill. Things don't just move through the process because they're great ideas. It takes people supporting it. And as I'm going to keep trying to get my colleagues to support it, I'm going to keep trying to get the Senate President to bring it to the Senate floor for a vote. I think it would be helpful if each of you could do that as well. And you're each represented by one of my 32 colleagues, and or you may have the misfortune of being represented by me yourself. But in that case, you don't need to call me and tell me to pass my own bill, because I'm already going to do that. But and then as well, once we get it passed through the Senate and over to the House, we're going to need another push to get it done there as well. And so the bill is bill number, Senate Bill 96, and I appreciate your help and support as we first try to get it up on the Senate floor for a vote, and then try to get it passed through the House.